and welcome to another One More Film Blog podcast. I am Ken Morefield, the owner and operator of the One More Film Blog, and I'm pleased to have back as my guest again, Edward Brown, who is a full-time student and part-time film critic. Edward, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Oh, I'm glad to be back.
So our theme for this podcast is streaming and under the radar options. I know with the pandemic drawing to a close and theaters opening up, there are some people that are happier to return to the movies theaters, but we wanted to give some screening options for people who maybe still feel a little bit more comfortable screening from home. So Edward, you've done a lot of work of looking at things that are going direct to video or smaller studio titles that are opening on video on demand at the same time as art house theaters, and we thought that we would highlight a couple of those options that people would have to give them some screening choices if they weren't, necessarily down for the big, megaplex opening in there. So I thought I would start with Jazz Fest, which is a new documentary that you just took a look at. And what can you tell us about that title?
So Jazz Fest is a fascinating exploration of the history of New Orleans jazz, and specifically the Jazz Festival that happens there every year. I feel like it helps to dispel the misconception that jazz is Black music, because the documentary makes a very concerted effort to portray jazz as American music. And as you watch the documentary, it is conspicuous, how white the audience is, how eclectic the talent is, and just the idea that New Orleans has always been an eclectic city, and the documentary really captures that feeling and that reality.
So, go ahead. I was just going to ask, do you feel like that was a intentional on the part of the film, or is that just something you noticed while watching it?
Right. So it's pretty obvious that the intent of the filmmakers was to send that message. At one point, Irva Thomas says, "There's no such thing as separate culture in New Orleans. It's all blended together." And that's really the theme of the whole documentary.
Okay.
And at one point, they refer back to Katrina, which will live in infamy in New Orleans history, and they really show how building back from that disaster wasn't about Black or white or any race in particular. It was a community coming together to build New Orleans back and kind of achieve that eclectic existence that they've always enjoyed together.
So if I'm not familiar with jazz, which I'm not very familiar with jazz, how much will that hurt me? Do I have to know jazz really well to like the documentary?
So I think if you were unfamiliar with jazz, it may turn you on to jazz, actually, because there's a lot of raw emotion that comes through the documentary. And specifically, I don't think I've ever seen interviews in a documentary done more earnestly. And I think the fact that every artist that participated in the documentary gets a vignette of sorts to kind of just show their performance at Jazz Fest, and they're all really good.
Okay, so that sounds like a thumbs up or an endorsement, from.
It's fantastic, not only from a musical standpoint, but it does a very good job of showing the history of New Orleans and the resiliency and the camaraderie of the city. Which I think is at a time when our society is so divisive, so divided. It's just nice to see people come together.
Good. So shifting gears a little bit from a new documentary to a revival film, you recently took a look at the director's cut DVD of the, I don't know if I could call it a classic film, but the well-known film Sex and Lucia. Um, so, and I believe, was that a 20th anniversary or 25th anniversary, or was it just a new
So
director's
Sex and
cut?
Lucia came out in 2001.
2001. So it could be like the 20th anniversary
Right.
director's cut. Now I noticed on the promotional material, they were trumpeting it as, quote, one of the most erotic films of all time. Does it live up to that billing?
So in the review that I wrote, I refer to it as not being porn, but porn adjacent.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of sex in it, for one. There's a lot of graphic sex in it. And one more film blog referred to European media as being grittier and more explicit than most Americans are used to, and this 100% substantiates that claim.
Yeah, I think you were quoting a review that I did about European television, sort of saying like, but I think that holds for the film as well. Not to take a deep dive away from, the film itself, but what would you say is the difference between, like, they use the word erotic and we use the word porn, or, porn adjacent. What is the difference between that? Is it just how explicit it is, or how the sex is used, or,
So in American film, porn is porn if its intention is to arouse.
Okay.
Erotica is erotica if its intention is to be artistic.
Okay.
And there's no doubt that Sex and Lucia is meant to be artistic.
Okay.
And it's artistic because it explores how sex and relationships color each other. And the question that the film ultimately tries to answer is, would you prefer a torrid love affair with an intimate partner, or would you prefer true love? And is it
like both, please?
Right. And right. And one of the things about that the film centers around is how difficult it is to have both.
Yeah.
Because the torrid nature of great sex in a long-lasting relationship, there's a reality that fades over time. And that it leads to jealousy. It leads to vice in the form of, if you like hot sex, if the sex that you're having gets boring, like what steps are you willing to take next to keep that fire going?
So Esther Perel, who's not a film critic, but is, a relationship therapist and famous author, she deals with a lot of those questions, both on her masterclass and in her TED Talks. And in some of her books. I know I've read her book about the state of affairs, which was, from a marriage counselor on why people have affairs or whatever. And she talks a lot about that sort of, classic tension between wanting security in a relationship, but also wanting passion in a relationship. And that those two things can push and pull, or are really hard to balance, because passion by its very nature makes you feel vulnerable, and so the more security you have, maybe the less passion or newness or excitement that you have. The more excitement that you have, the less security that you have, and it can be really difficult to find that balance.
And the film tackles that through the form of jealousy, where Lucia and the male character, Lorenzo, they do have a very passionate relationship that eventually is compromised by jealousy. And like you just said, like that is a very real thing that people deal with, which makes like passion such a complicated component of an intimate relationship, right? Because you want that, but it's scary. because it is a component of vulnerability. Because
Have you ever seen or have you seen the Stanley Kubrick film Eyes Wide Shut?
I'm very familiar with it. I don't think I've actually ever seen it.
Seen the whole, okay. I was gonna ask for like a comparison in terms of that's sort of a benchmark of maybe the most sexually explicit or film that a lot of Americans have seen, or in terms of like how the two of them compare. But you may not then feel comfortable comparing them if you haven't really seen or fully. Is there a more American film that you can draw a comparison to give people an idea of because like saying it has a lot of sex in it can be relative to the particular audience. I know when I reviewed for Christianity Today or something, and if someone was shown in their underwear or whatever, they would like that scandalous or whatever. And then, to the other extreme, there would be like, something that some people might say is a lot, and other people are just like, didn't. So I didn't know if there was.
A Clockwork Orange comes to mind.
Okay, yeah, and of course that's difficult because there's R-rated or explicit content, but it's not within the context of trying to arouse or trying to be sexy or portray it as being sexy.
Right, and the big difference here is there are scenes in Sex and Lucia that I think an American audience would consider pornographic.
Okay, so that seems more of a either a mixed review or sort of like a positive review, but know your audience, or I always say audience know thyself or whatever. It's like, if a film is called Sex and Lucia, don't blame me if you go into it and say there was a lot of sex in this particular movie.
Right. So it's a difficult movie to watch simply because it's hard to follow. It's very art house. And yeah, if you are in any way, shape, or form averse to sex on screen, you're gonna be watching it.
So strong caution there for for maybe I want to say conservative audiences, but I don't mean politically conservative. I mean for people who are a little bit conservative in their taste. And
like your kids need to be at grandma's,
okay,
at their grandparents' house if you're gonna watch this.
All right. So another sort of big shifting gears there, tonal shift. You had looked at the Israeli film Plan A, and I thought that was an interesting plot, and you had some interesting comments about that. So, what can you tell listeners about Plan A as a film that they might see on their streaming options but not really know what it's about?
So Plan A I think is a fascinating movie because it's a historical drama that most people are unaware even happened. And personally, I love history, particularly the Holocaust, just because of how monumental an event it was in human history. But I had no idea this had even happened. And just the raw emotion that goes along with the Holocaust in and of itself is interesting enough. But the main character, Max, really embodies the agony that went along with being a victim of the Holocaust. He loses his house to a neighbor who turns his family in. He confronts that neighbor, and the neighbor has absolutely no compassion for him whatsoever. And I just feel like that is just so indicative of how European Jews were treated during the time that I think you don't want to beat civilization over the head with it, but I don't think it's something that should ever be forgotten. And I think as more and more Holocaust survivors die, that story needs to keep being told.
Yeah, it sounds to me too like, if I can circle back and draw a connection to Jazz Fest, you were talking about the aftermath of Katrina and taking a community and rather driving it further apart of drawing it together. And I know that, a lot of us are concerned, at the current state of American politics and just how divisive it is in terms of, along racial lines, along political lines, along, religious lines or something like that. And so, I think there's an interesting juxtaposition in those two films between the potential of the human spirit when embodied correctly to overcome those divisions and to be drawn closer together, versus the sort of dark warning of this is what can happen if we allow those divisions to fester and grow and remain unchallenged, where, we can then become incredibly destructive towards one another.
Right. So the Holocaust in and of itself is the perfect embodiment of the evil that humans have the capacity for. And one of the questions that the film asks is, how do you respond to such evil? And the character Max wrestles with that question throughout the film, and ultimately gives a pretty good answer by the end of the film.
Okay.
Which is to let it go.
What is Plan A? I mean, we sort of skirted around the title in terms of, but
right. So Plan A was a plot to basically poison the water supply in Nuremberg.
Okay.
To kill millions of Germans as retribution for the millions of Jews that were killed. Right. It was basically an eye for an eye mentality, which, as a viewer, you find yourself in a bit of a quandary because you can't really fault that sense of vengeance, but you can't really endorse the means don't justify that. It's hard to agree with what the intended result is going to be.
You understand the feelings that are motivating it, because I think we've all felt that rage at injustice or unfairness or at human atrocities, but then also actually seeing it acted on or attempted to be acted on, and seeing the effects that it has and the way that it perpetuates even greater injustices or ripples, is also a very sobering warning about what happens to us, not just as a culture, but what happens to us individually if we allow that hatred and anger and division to fester.
Right. And so the group that makes Plan A is a macro view. Max, who was kind of the lens through which we see this all play out, is the micro view, which basically essentially gives us what you just said.
Okay. Good. And then finally, shifting gears yet again, you had an office comedy by Rick Castaneda called All Sorts. So we've sort of run from jazz music documentary to erotica to the Holocaust. So what's left there but Office Space. I think you described All Sorts in your review as Office Space meets something.
Beetlejuice.
Office Space meets Beetlejuice. Okay, so that's an intriguing tagline. What can you tell us about All Sorts?
So you started off the podcast talking about how One More Film Blog gives smaller films the opportunity to get the publicity that they wouldn't necessarily get from big movie studios. And that's one of the best things one of the biggest joys I've had working with One More Film Blog is that movies like All Sorts get a voice, because this is a fantastic movie, because it shows how the reality of work is just such a drudgery. What can be fulfilling if you enjoy the people around you. And the surrealism of it, which is why I compare it to Beetlejuice, makes it fun. But the reality of working in an office is what makes it comparable to Office.
Well, and so a lot of us maybe have never played jazz music, although we've heard it. We hopefully, haven't been, part of the Holocaust, but we can relate to, like I've been in an office or had a boring office job, or, even if you haven't had a boring office job, you've had a class or some kind of thing where those
Right.
are sort of almost universal human emotions or tropes. Now, by mentioning Office Space, we'll say Office Space, Dilbert. This is ground that's been covered before. Is there something fresh or new about the way that All Sorts kind of skewers or makes comedy out of the boring office drudge?
Right. So it leans into being a surrealist
Okay.
project, and ostensibly it's super goofy, right? The idea of a filing competition,
Mm-hmm.
like it sounds goofy, but Jake Castaneda makes it relevant because it literally is the foundation between that foundation of the relationship between the two main characters,
Mm-hmm.
and it shows how work can be fulfilling.
Okay. So it sounds like, as well as just sort of the comedy or lampooning, that there's also an affirming message, in the comedy that, we laugh at it, but that there's also, you know, uh, something a little bit more thoughtful at at the tail end of the comedy. It's not just laugh, laugh, laugh and forget or whatever. It's laugh, 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 but then there's also a point to it or something that's
Right.
conveyed.
Exactly. And like I said, if you give like a Marxist criticism of the movie,
Mm-hmm.
the film establishes work as a necessary evil, but by the end of it, Diego and June, which are the two main characters,
Mm-hmm.
like show like how it could be something that's creative and fulfilling.
Good. Wow. That's a powerful affirmation or whatever. So it makes me want to, think more about the film or revisit it, and hopefully it will make people want to seek it out. Because I will acknowledge that, these are films that the audience will probably have to go look for. We'll have to go look, go on to the streaming platform of their, on their Roku, on the movie store or whatever. As opposed to just showing up at the multiplex and, saying, where is it? But it sounds as though, if you take the time to look for it, that it will, that some of these films will definitely pay you back for the little bit of extra effort that you had to go, find them and look for them. So, and I like too the fact that you sort of highlighted they're four very different films for four very different audiences. So, hopefully, if documentaries are not your bag, there's a comedy. If you're not really into comedy,
Right.
there's a documentary, or there's some history in there for the history buffs in there. So, a little bit of something for everyone. If you had to pick one, as sort of like your as sort of like your, cream of the crop, could you do that, or is that too close?
So I would pick All Sorts just
Okay.
because of how well it's shot
Mm-hmm.
and just how creative it was.
Okay. Good. That's all I got. Anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, and I can't stress enough how fantastic a platform One More Film Blog is for movies that don't get the steam that they probably
Mm-hmm.
deserve.
Okay, well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. Edward, thank you for joining me. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. And if you do happen to look at Jazz Fest, Sex and Lucia, Plan A, or All Sorts, drop us a comment in the comment section on YouTube or on One More Film Blog. Let us know what you think, and if there are other small independent screening films that you'd like to know about, or that you would like to hear Edward and I comment on in One More Film Blog, feel free to leave us some recommendations. And until then, we'll see you at the movies.